Okay, so now I have described, the digitizing process, how I used AI, and now I want to talk about the actual manuscript itself. So I'm Julie Bonner. I'm walking through some videos right now of how I wrote Loose Pearls, a memoir that's based on 548 letters written between my paternal grandparents in World War II. So 548 letters, initially it might hit you that that's a lot of letters, but when you're actually looking at them and reading through them, it's monumental to try and make sense out of it. So, like the last video, I talked about this master log that AI helped me to create. And so basically, we were reading through all the letters again and making choices as to what would go in the book, what wouldn't go in the book, what quotes would be there, what would be left out, that sort of thing. So there's a few things about this that I want to talk about. First of all, I wanted historical context, right? Because not every letter talks about the war. These are two people who are married to each other. They're separated because of a war, and they are just living their lives. It just so happens that for a period of 18 months, they were separated by this war. And when my grandfather went into the war, he was preparing to be a soldier, and I knew as a kid that my grandfather had been in the army and that he was part of occupation forces, that he had actually never seen combat, where my other grandfather did. And I had often wondered about that, and it's not something that I thought of at the time as being a child to ask him because my paternal grandfather died in 1978, and I was, at that time when he died, I had just turned 14. Okay. I didn't start getting interested in family history until I was 16. So it didn't even dawn on me to ask him. But I've often wondered over the years, how was he just in occupation forces? Um, I also hadn't really paid attention to the timeline that he entered the war kind of late. Um, and and it was because they were running out of 18-year-olds that he got drafted. So, you know, it's like, okay, so a lot of things started to make sense once I asked AI, can you please, for every entry on this Excel log that we built, can you please add, was there anything historically significant happening at that time? So what I learned from the historical context after that got added in was, oh, so actually the bomb, the bombs that got dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima actually happened right before he was being deployed. So he knew that lots of combat action were not going to be something that he would be subjected to, but I didn't really understand that. I didn't really understand that he was actually being deployed as fighting forces, but converted to occupation forces at the time he actually got on a boat to go to the Philippines. So that historical context was really important because the book itself will talk about, and like a lot of letters that we read through, it was like, okay, yeah, clearly she's cooking dinner and breakfast and lunch every day. She's, washing laundry and doing chores and, various things like that, dealing with her two sons, of which one was my father. So she's doing all of these things. And a lot of that for my family, of course, is nice to read, right? She would talk about family members in these letters. Not all of those threads were all that interesting. I knew they all lived near each other. I lived near all of them when I was a kid, so I know exactly what she's talking about, when she says, the nephews came over, or such and so came by and visited. Um, so there's lots of those kinds of things that we just didn't put into the book. Um, because It's just a husband writing to a wife and a wife writing to a husband. That's it. You know. And even Woodrow, a lot of times, was just talking about personal things. He wasn't talking about his experiences in the army. He did a lot, of course, but not every single word was about that. Some of it was about Alabama football or Pickens County High School football, because he was into sports bigly. Okay. So the historical context was huge. Then I asked AI to give me what it thought would be a good subdivision of chapters or how we could organize it. And it suggested that we do his training and deployment, Philippines, Japan, and his return home. So there are 4 parts to the book, and every chapter fits under one of those parts. And I thought that made sense, right? Because that's his journey from when he was drafted to when he was released from the army. So I agreed with what AI had recommended. So then we started drafting chapters and drafting content. And essentially, AI would write a chapter and I would read it word for word. We did not change anything about the quoted texts from the letters between my grandmother and grandfather. We didn't change any of that, but that is inserted in every chapter multiple times, often, because each chapter, a lot of times these letters talked about similar things, and so we picked up on those threads and stories that might be happening through the book or through the letters, and so we crafted those like that. Now, here's one thing to be aware of with any AI tool, especially around something like this. It will make assumptions. You have to be really careful with what assumptions AI is taking. And I'll give you a really good example of this. Throughout the letters, my grandparents, now I know how many children they had. They had 3. Now, at the time of the war, they had 2. The third child didn't come until much later in 1955. And so I know that through the letters, one of the common threads that they talked about a lot was they wanted to have a girl. They never had a girl. Now, AI assumed they did. So AI wrote in a lot of these chapters where it mentioned, that they wanted a girl, that a girl came later, and a girl did not come later. So I had to go back and make sure all of those passages were correct, that there was no girl. They never had a daughter. And so making sure that it doesn't read between the lines and create something that doesn't exist, And it might actually require a prompt, and I did this a few times, with AI, not necessarily around this book, but one of the things I've learned about AI is, you can ask it, if you're making an assumption, ask me questions, right? So you might want to go that route, you know. So you do have to read every word. You do have to make sure that it's written as you would write it, um, and then make those changes accordingly. So the book is heavily edited by me. It was a suggestion made by AI based on the log of letters that we had in Excel. And so it built the original manuscript off of that. Now, the original manuscript was around, I don't know, maybe 150 to 180 words. By the time I did revisions, of which I'll talk about another one here in a moment, but after I did all the revisions and everything, it was about 200-ish pages, something like that. Um, so one of the other things that I did was I added a few pictures. All right. So I wrote a prologue, which is all written by me. And essentially what the prologue is, who were my grandparents before my grandfather got drafted? Who were they? Where were they born? How did they grow up? Where did they live? The things that I knew about them from their lives prior to that. Now, do I know everything as a granddaughter? No, I don't. But I do know a few things. I know a little bit about how they met because I'd actually asked my grandmother about that. Because they didn't grow up in the same area of Alabama, and I had often wondered, how did they even meet? When you're in an agricultural type society, you don't travel far, right? So how in the world did they meet? They lived 2 hours apart, you know. Um, they wouldn't have been hanging out in the same circles and all that. So I got information about that. So I did know about all of that, and I knew when they got married, et cetera, et cetera. And there you go. So I could kind of give a hint of who they were prior to the war, prior to his involvement in the war. I also put a picture of him and her, my dad, and his middle brother that was alive during this time, right? So you see pictures of them. I also put a little snippet of my family tree in there so you can see how I'm related to these two people, my dad, etc., and my great grandparents, because they're mentioned in the letters. Okay. So I added all of that. I also added a coda, or like a post log, of what happened to them after he got back. So that's when I talk about they didn't have a girl. They never had a girl. Now, I also know that my grandmother miscarried several times. I don't know how many times, um, in between the middle brother and the younger brother. I don't know those details, but I do know that that happened. Uh, so I put that in the book. Because honestly, I wanted to give a picture of who my grandparents are. You know, everybody's complicated. Not everybody is one-dimensional. Um, they clearly loved each other, but I also know that they fought with each other, you know. From what I understand, they had some epic fights at times. And that my grandmother, as small as she was about my height, uh, she could give as well as she got. That's what I've been told. Um, and I do know that my grandmother was very headstrong, but so was my grandfather. In fact, when I look at both sets of my grandparents, um, I consider this my fiery side of the family. And my mother's parents were the ice side of the family. They were just very quiet, very slow to anger. Uh, Amazing contrast between the two sets of parents. Grandparents. It was pretty amazing. So I added those pieces in. I added in my recollection of my grandparents. But this was also their story. It's not my story. I was trying to give it justice. So one of the other things too that I had to decide was how I was going to write it, in first person or third person, etc. And I decided to write it as a first person narrative, meaning that when I talked about my grandparents, I'd say my grandfather wrote. I didn't say Woodrow wrote. Or when I talked about my grandmother, I said my grandmother wrote or my grandmother said, right? Because it's me writing about them, writing through the lens of their letters, and me providing context that I know of their lives. And I tried not to make assumptions of my own. I really checked myself several times of like, did she actually own a string of pearls or just these loose pearls? And and as far as I know, she never actually owned a string of pearls, which was a common thread through several letters that they wrote back and forth because my grandfather hunted for weeks to try and find her a string of pearls that he could afford to buy. And uh, and in the book you find out, a lot of the inflation that was happening in Japan, and it just made it impossible. And various other things that were happening at the time that made it impossible to buy a string of pearls. So you had all of that, right? So I decided to write it as I am the granddaughter. I'm talking about my grandfather, my grandmother. And so I always referred to them as my grandfather, my grandmother. And then finally, adding the bibliography because I didn't want to make a claim about when bombs are dropped or when accords took place or anything like that without, the a source for where they came from. Okay. Where that data came from. Because I'm not a historian. That's not my background. I love history. It's one of the reasons I got into family genealogy in the first place, is that I love history. I love looking at the lives of those who have come before me and looking at our own personal context in the world. And so uh, I definitely wanted a bibliography, and AI did help me to pull all of that together with my review. So there you go. That was the writing process. And yes, that took a while because, you're reading through however many hundreds of pages and, making sure that assumptions, what assumptions are you making? Is this defensible? Can I make this claim? Can I not make this claim, et cetera, et cetera. And so it took a little while to get all that done. So finally, in the next video, I will talk about the publishing process on KDP, which is where I published it, and walk you through kind of the decisions that I made about the AI questions that now show up on KDP. Okay. So anyway, I'll see you on the next video. Thank you.